All right, we will be discussing a 19th century author, Dorothy Wordsworth. And if you look in the lecture, there is a picture of her, so you can see what she looks like. Um, that's in the lecture document, the written out version. And the work of hers we read for class this week is When Shall I Tread Your Garden Path? All right, now also the written out lecture has a couple websites. If you want to learn more about Dorothy Wordsworth, you can delve into those. There's a website link that has stories about poems of and biographical information on Dorothy. And there's a YouTube clip that provides an intriguing account of Dorothy Wordsworth's life and work. So you can check those out if you'd like. So Dorothy Wordsworth lived from about 1771 to 1855 till about 84 years old. She had 4 brothers, no sisters. Her famous poet brother is William Wordsworth. He was actually poet laureate of England. So he's a really, really famous poet. He was 20 months older than Dorothy. Unfortunately, the children's parents died when they were quite young, and 5 siblings were split up and sent off to be raised by different relatives. Yeah, very sad. And this actually happened often during these times, even into the 1900s. From my own family, I had my grandmother. She had parents that had died, and they had 10 children. Yeah, they're 10 children. They were split up. Not only split up and farmed out to different relatives, but some relatives even changed their names because they didn't like the name that the child had, and so they changed it to one they liked. And these are children who would have lived with that name for some time. So this kind of fate was not uncommon to people who lost their parents or even one parent, because people could not make ends meet, and they, rather than have children go live in orphanages, and sometimes there weren't even orphanages, the children would be split up and farmed out to different relatives. Dorothy lived by herself with an aunt, but when Dorothy was 24, her brother William inherited enough money for the 2 of them to live together finally. They became constant companions from then on. When Dorothy was 31, William married Dorothy's best friend, Mary Hutchinson. The marriage was initially so devastating to Dorothy that she could not even attend the wedding. I think she felt a little betrayed that her brother and her best friend would marry and maybe left out of both their lives that had been so important to her to that point. Dorothy herself never married, but she continued to live with William and Mary until Dorothy's death. Until she died, she lived with them. Dorothy helped care for William and Mary's children even. In turn, when Dorothy became increasingly senile in her 60s, William and Mary took care of her until her death at the age of 84. Dorothy and William were almost inseparable companions. Dorothy assiduously and enthusiastically recorded the daily life the 2 of them shared together. Her many journal pages provide beautiful, compelling, and lively descriptions of her and her brother's life in the pastoral Lake District of England. So they lived in a very beautiful area, very natural, very, the countryside. And a lot of that you can see in their poetry. They constantly invoke nature and describe the nature. So her journals from this time period, one of them is called the Grassmere Journal, and it details numerous walks, activities, and countryside that her brother, William, often immortalized in his own poetry. So I told you, is the poet laureate of England. So he's that's like the most prominent poet of England. And his poetry is very well known for being natural and romantic. And a lot of that detail came from Dorothy's journals and her observations that she made on her walks with her brother. All right, so William acknowledged Dorothy's companionship and journalings as the source of much of his poetry, even. Yeah, so that's kind of neat. Wordsworth used Dorothy's journal as a literal catalog of their natural surroundings when he was incorporating those details in his poetry. For example, compare this April 15th, 1802 passage from Dorothy's Grasmere Journal. Quote, "When we were in the woods beyond Gowbarrow Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seeds ashore and that the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and yet more, and at last, under the boughs of the tree, we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones, as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced, and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever glancing, ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little knot, and a few stragglers a few yards higher up, but they were so few as not to disturb the simplicity and unity and life of that one busy highway." Unquote. And compare that journal entry to the following lines from William's famous poem, "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." Quote, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high and o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, that stretched in ne'er-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beyond them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee." Unquote. Those were lines 1 through 14 of William Wordsworth's famous poem, "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." So you can see that discussion of daffodils that she has in her Grasmere Journal entry on that day is very much incorporated in Wordsworth's poem. That image of the highway spreading on along the lake, he encompasses in his poem. Not only the inspiration of Wordsworth's poetry, Dorothy's writings recorded the evolution of William's poetry, as well as portraits of their friends and fellow literary greats from the time period: Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Sir Walter Scott, Charles Lamb, and Robert Southey. So those are all really famous poets from that time period, or famous authors, and she writes all about her friendship with them. Dorothy's writings themselves were beautiful and poetic. However, none of them were published in her lifetime, unlike the poetry of her brother, who himself was the Poet Laureate of England from, actually, 1843 till he died in 1850. So, yeah, kind of the story of a lot of women, right? Nothing got published in her lifetime, but her brother's poetry did. So that's kind of interesting. She certainly had the connections, right, to get them published, and yet hers weren't. Anyway, Dorothy almost published the account of her 1803 travels in Scotland with William, but ultimately no one would publish it. No one, even though her brother was an accomplished and published poet, and her journal entries contributed the material he used for those poems, yet she could not get her journals published. Her journals, letters, and verse work were not published until long after her death, when literary scholarship of the late 19th century started investigating the writings of females. Yeah, that's what it took. Dorothy's writing that we read here for class is a poem she wrote in 1835. When shall I tread your garden path? The poem was written during Dorothy's downward spiral into the dementia that plagued the rest of her life. A sadness and yearning for her free days outside in the country is juxtaposed with the enfeebling conditions that bound her to the couch. Quote, here's a line from the poem. Here are lines 3 through 6 from the poem. Quote, when shall I wander free as air and track the foaming rill, a prisoner on my pillowed couch? 5 years in feebleness I've lain. Unquote. And we have this wandering, this yearning to wander outdoors as freely as the air that she writes about in this line. Interestingly, her brother wrote that poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. So there's a lot of wandering that makes up her poetry, his poetry, a lot of freedom to this countryside and nature that they would explore and then use as the inspirations for their writing. All right, enjoy Dorothy's life and the poem of hers we read. Thank you.